Today we're going to be covering the key actors and groups in the civil rights movement. This is part of the IB History program. Martin Luther King Jr. was a young pastor of the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church, expert in systematic theology and an activist and leader in the NAACP when he first became an important figure after his involvement in the 382-day Montgomery bus boycott. In the 13 years from 1955 to his assassination in 1968, Martin Luther King Jr. became the single most recognized and influential civil rights leader in the United States. In the months following the boycott, King and the other pastors from African American churches met to create a new civil rights organization, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, SCLC, of which he was elected president. It took its ideals from Christianity and its nonviolent tactical methods from Mahatma Gandhi. The Nobel Prize reports that from 1957 to 1968, King spoke over 2,500 times, appearing wherever there was injustice, protest, and action. Wrote 5 books, was arrested upwards of 20 times, and assaulted at least 4 times. Letter from Birmingham jail and the I Have a Dream speech from the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom resonates throughout history. In his letter from Birmingham jail, King responds to an editorial by 8 Alabama clergymen, all white, in which they criticize the actions and methods of King and others for choosing to protest in Birmingham. First, because they are outsiders, and also in the light of the moderate new city administration. King was arrested along with hundreds of other protesters in Birmingham. In a solitary cell, he wrote his response in newspaper margins. His words articulated the conditions in the Jim Crow South, the ethical reasons behind the choice made by himself, other members of the SCLC, and African Americans from other locations to protest in Birmingham, and an integrationist pro-American philosophy that advocated for the full participation of African Americans in every aspect of life in the United States. The I Have a Dream speech was delivered in August of 1963. It was the last of many speeches given that day and was the first time that many white Americans had heard King speak. The cadences and techniques he used were in the long tradition of the African American church. The speech pointed to injustice, religion, and faith, but it was also a call for justice. The end of the speech, with a repetition of I Have a Dream, also pointed to a goal of racial, religious, and ethnic integration in a harmonious America. King developed contacts and influence in both the Kennedy and Johnson's administration. In the midst of his campaign for the presidency in 1960, just a week before the election, Kennedy called King's wife Coretta to express concern for her then imprisoned husband, while Kennedy's brother Robert used his influence to secure King's release on bail. When Lyndon B. Johnson became president on November 22, 1963, following Kennedy's assassination, King worked to develop a relationship with him in spite of some doubts as to the new president's commitment to the civil rights. In fact, Johnson proved to be a more forceful ally than Kennedy, since Johnson actually passed a lot of acts in Congress. Most of his criticism is based on his reliance on nonviolence, gradualism, which is basically the small approach for civil rights. It was not just an immediate action. He was also critiqued for expanding his advocacy to issues beyond civil rights and for using his fame over activism. Malcolm X stands among civil rights leaders since he focused on the deplorable conditions of African Americans living in the urban North. His childhood experiences of racism, threats and violence against his family, as well as the breakup of his family and the placement of the children in different homes, contributed to his views of African American society. His conversion to the Nation of Islam, known as the NOI, during his time in prison for armed robbery speaks to his religious intersection to civil rights. It was common practice among converts of the Nation of Islam to change their last name from their slave surname to an X, which was representative of the unknown African name of their ancestors. Malcolm X uh, changed his last name from Little to the famous X. The NOI ideology was preached by Elijah Muhammad. It was based on racial solidarity and superiority. He taught that discipline and economic self reliance was critical and that African Americans should become more highly educated and practice small scale community capitalism, owning local businesses and patronizing black owned stores. Abstinence from vice and community building were key, and especially in northern urban ghettos. Malcolm X became a spokesperson and editor of The Messenger, Noy's print publication, soon after leaving prison in 1952. He appealed to the desperation of urban blacks. In Harlem, New York, he attracted thousands to the NOI Mosque No. 7, giving impassioned speeches promoting the ideals of self-reliance and faith, as well as denouncing white Americans as the enemy. As a result, membership soared to over 50,000. Mr. X's ideology was centered around black nationalism. White society was corrupt and corrupted everything it touched. African Americans thus needed to control their own education, politics, and economy. In the Ballot or the Bullet speech of April 3, 1964, Mr. X explained that black nationalism only means that the black man should control the politics and the politicians in his own community. That we will have to carry on a political program of re-education, make us more politically conscious, politically matured. This basically fueled the Black Pride movement, which celebrated African heritage as well as strongly advocating solidarity in a society that worked to keep them weak and fragmented. This basically broke with the standards of white society in the United States. In 1964, Malcolm X went on a pilgrimage to Mecca. He returned to the United States as a Sunni Muslim and changed his name to El Hajj Malik El Shabazz. He no longer espoused the inherent evilness of white Americans, but still strongly condemned pervasive racism within the United States. He spoke in favor of Pan-Africanism while admitting its limits and criticized capitalism, but advocated black nationalism and praised African American entrepreneurship, again following his previous ideology. Malcolm X's efforts at building the OAAU and working with other civil rights leaders were tragically cut short. On February 21, 1965, Mr. X was assassinated while giving a speech in the Audubon Ballroom in Harlem, leaving a legacy that both united and divided the civil rights movement. The other major public figure that we need to talk about is Lyndon B. Johnson. Johnson's conversion to civil rights came late in his career with his election as president. He grew up in small town Texas and began his professional career teaching Mexican American children in a segregated school. At the height of the Great Depression, he ran the National Youth Administration in Texas before starting his long career in elected office in the late 1930s. By the 50s, however, he could be considered the most powerful Democrat in the U.S. Senate. While the focus of Johnson's government was foreign policy, the Cold War, nuclear research, and Vietnam, he did begin his presidency with a speech on the war on poverty, handling a couple of civil rights issues. He helped pass the Civil Rights Act in 1964 as a response to the violence in Selma, the Voting Rights Act of 1965 calling for a joint session of Congress, and in response to urban riots, the Fair Housing Act of 1968. Now we're going to be moving on to the multiple civil rights organizations that were key in the development of the civil rights movement and the struggle for African Americans. The first one is the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, NAACP. It was a racial and religiously integrated organization since 1909 when it was founded. Charter members and early members included Webb Dubois, Mary White Ovington, Joel and Arthur Spingarn, Mary McLeod Bethune, and famous reformists of the era Lincoln Stephens and Jane Addams. The NAACP's purpose was to secure for all people the rights guaranteed in the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the United States Constitution, which promised an end to slavery, the equal protections of the law, and universal adult male suffrage. Included in its work was its publication The Crisis, whose editor was Webb Dubois. Its charter began in the North and later opened in southern states as a battle against lynching, lobbying for civil rights legislation, and arduous activism spread across the United States. Its legal team was composed of Chief Legal Strategist Charles Hamilton Houston, attorney and future Supreme Court Justice Thurgood Marshall, and basically was led through the NAACP Legal Defense and Education Fund. In terms of activism, they developed the NAACP Youth Council, which participated in multiple sittings. They bailed the Freedom Riders. They lobbied for voter rights. And more than anything, they were key in pushing for Martin Luther King's career. Their most important members were Rosa Parks, Daisy Bates, the force behind the Little Rock Nine, Ella Baker, who helped create the Student Nonviolence Coordinating Committee, SNCC, Martin Luther King Jr., and overall, all of them were a big part of the civil rights movement, regardless of their participation in this organization. The second major organization that we need to discuss is the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, SCLC. It led, co-led, and participated in scores of campaigns and events from its inception in 1957. Their primary tactic was nonviolent participation, however, always at the forefront of protest. The origins of the SCLC is directly associated with the Montgomery bus boycott and the important role of African American ministers, principally Reverends Ralph David Abernathy and Martin Luther King Jr. Its objective is the following. This conference is called because we have no moral choice before God but to delve deeper into the struggle and to do so with great reliance on nonviolence and with greater unity, coordination, sharing, and Christian understanding. Again, it's a religious organization that fully fights for civil rights. Their main officers, again, were King, Abernathy, the Reverend C.K. Steele of Tallahassee, Florida, and the Reverend T.J. Jamison from Baton Rouge, Louisiana. CSLC membership was open to all races, religions, and backgrounds. Its coordination was based on local organizations. Their key actions, they basically trained thousands of activists across the United States in the philosophy of Christian nonviolent resistance. Again, nonviolent, but violence being a key ideology for Martin Luther King as well. They developed leadership training and citizenship schools, again, during Freedom Summer. They set a lot of class action lawsuits against state and local governments for maintaining segregated public facilities and schools as well. They created voter registration drives. They led boycotts against stores that would not employ African Americans. And they also created Operation Breadbasket in Atlanta in 1962 to combat poverty as a cause of African American oppression as well. Another major organization is the Student Nonviolence Coordinating Committee, the SNCC. It was a grassroots organization that was established in April of 1960 in the midst of the college student lunch counter sit-ins. It became the leading force for voter registration in the Deep South's Black Belt. This Black Belt is basically all the rural areas of the Deep South in which African Americans comprised a majority of the population, and they were often unaffected by Reconstruction. They're still basically behaving as slaves and are treated as slaves. Under the leadership of James Lawson of Vanderbilt University and Marion Barry of Fisk University, the SNCC dedicated itself to the philosophy and methodology of nonviolent direct action and this idea of the beloved community. The first major action taken by the SNCC was to combine with CORE, which was another organization, to organize the Freedom Rides, having Diane Nash push towards their full success. During the Freedom Summer, they also focused on voter registration with one man, one vote campaigns. The Albany movement came to end discrimination in transportation and public facilities, and the March on Washington with this Martin Luther King's famous "I Have a Dream" speech. By the late 1960s, the organization had to shift due to the excessive amount of violence. The SNCC began to exclude white Americans from some activities, and within a year, white Americans were expelled and nonviolence reduced from an organizing philosophy to a tactic. In 1968, the N in SNCC no longer represented nonviolent, but rather stood for national, and within 2 years, it ceased to exist and instead it basically was taken over by the Panther Party, the BPP. Um, it followed mostly black nationalism as a major ideological proponent for the civil rights movement. Finally, the Nation of Islam, or the NOI, focused on Africanism, African identity, racial separatism, righteous Islamic living, economic self-reliance, and self-governance, and it was raised as a prominent civil rights organization during the early 1920s. It was founded by Wallace D. Fard, also known as Fard Muhammad, in 1930. After his disappearance in 1934, Elijah Muhammad took over following a more radical message denouncing the white devil. Its message that radical separatism was necessary for African Americans to gain rights and economic status and stability differed significantly from every other civil rights organization at the time. Again, this is the same ideology that Malcolm X followed in terms of black nationalism and Pan-Africanism. They advocated for forceful self-defense, dismissing the concept of the beloved community and nonviolence that previous organizations had employed. It was basically founded to prepare and educate African Americans, called the original people, for the struggle to take back the earth and make it a peaceful paradise again. Very Judaic uh, savior kind of way. It created a variety of private schools to educate young African Americans in its teachings. Uh, in turn, the Fruit of Islam was created to protect such schools and mosques due to the violence they experience. Here we have members of the Fruit of Islam. Again, they look like soldiers because they act as soldiers as well. Followers also visited prisons to spread their faith. It was in prison that Malcolm Little converted to the Nation of Islam and became Malcolm X. The number of NOI followers increased to reach between 100,000 and 300,000 by the time that Malcolm X left the NOI in 1964. The Olympic boxing champion Cassius Clay converted to the NOI and took the name of Muhammad Ali. He's on the right. Luis Farrakhan joined the organization in 1955, becoming its second most effective speaker. He was seen and heard speaking at Mosque 7 in New York in 1959, and in the television special The Hate That Hate Produced. It's an important TV show that talked about this inherent racism in American society. The message repelled white liberal support. Big part of this organization was Malcolm X, and in one of his speeches, a very controversial speech called the Black Revolution, he says the following: God wants us to separate ourselves from this wicked white race here in America because this American house of bondage is number one in God's list for divine destruction today. I repeat, this American house of bondage is number one on God's list for divine destruction today. Amid nonviolent movements, the NOI was largely linked to the Black Power movement and the Black Panther Party, with espoused self-defense, black nationalism, and African American reliance. And in the end of the day, it played a counter movement to the peaceful protesting of Martin Luther King and the more religious organizations of Christian descent. Here's our lovely bibliography. Thank you to Mark Rogers and Peter Clinton, and we recognize the authors of all visual and auditory content in this presentation.